Okay, in this tutorial, we are going to look at the key step in the entire project, which is where you analyze your results. And it's part of the findings. In order to analyze results, you need to have done the first two steps, which is where you have been presenting your data using different graphing techniques in this case, and that should have already been done. So analysis or data analysis is not simply explanation. It's where you use the data that you are presenting in your explanation. And you also are looking to link your results back to any theories or diagrams or models that you have introduced in your background research as what your results should show. And you are going to be comparing your results to these theories or these models that you have presented at that earlier stage, which in this case is the model beach profile. And you'll see down here, that is one of the key things. That is where you actually start to access the very high marks. So let's have a little look about how we do some analysis and jump into the presentation of our data. Now, we have presented a number of different things at this stage. You will have started with the presentation of the beach profile from the shoreline to the back of the beach over here. And that's the first piece of data presentation. And the first thing you want to actually do is just introduce this piece of data presentation. What you want to make sure is you name this piece of data presentation. So this should be called Figure 1. That can appear down in the bottom left-hand corner of the graph. If you've integrated your graphs, you're both this one and the one showing your pH, then you can call them all Figure 1. But the key is just a basic descriptive introduction, so the reader understands what the data is showing before you embark on some kind of interpretation or analysis of the results. So you would be saying something along the lines that Figure 1 represents the beach profile, showing you the changing gradient from the shoreline to the grey dunes and behind the grey dunes, which occurred at 500 meters away from the sea. And you would probably then want to say a little bit of what the actual thing shows. So it can, you will have annotated this graph that this is the 4 dunes, these are the yellow dunes, these are the dune slags, these are the grey dunes, and this coniferous forestry back here. So if you have done that, you can have a very brief sentence just sort of outlining that change. And why that's important is because you're going to come back to that when you start your analysis of your pH being linked to this graph. So what you then want to do is start to draw some comparisons between your second piece of data presentation, which is the graph showing the changing pH. Now I've got one down here, which I'm just going to bring up. Just move the scatter graph down for a second, and we'll come back to that scatter graph in a minute. And bring this up. Now, in this case, I didn't ask you to do a bar graph for your changing pH. You could have. It's perfectly acceptable because a bar graph very clearly shows you the pH at each of the locations as you progressively move from the back of the beach to the front. And if we line that up perfectly with our beach profile, like there we go, we can see, first of all, that the pH seems to dramatically drop, and we can say from 8.6 to 7. So that would be, or a drop of 1.6, and give the locations between on the beach where that happens. You'd need to look at your data. Where did that drop happen? And you'd want to say that change is linked to, and then link it to where is that change linked to on the actual beach profile. Likewise, is there a link between the increase? So we were steadily decreasing all the way down to a 6.5, and then we have this increase in pHs in this little zone here. So is that happening? Where's that happening? And make that connection between these two, because remember the research question is actually about the change. Likewise, just to draw your attention to the very end, it has been coming down, and then it does increase a little bit at the very end rather than continue to drop? And is there some kind of link between that final increase and the final point on the Beach profile? Now, that is just doing a bit of description, but you've not actually done any detailed explanation apart from making the link. So the most crucial stage now is to think about the theoretical diagram. So that's one of these diagrams that you've been looking at and that you've used and is hopefully possibly appearing in your findings, and it will have definitely appeared in your background research. And first of all, do some analysis. So your analysis here is thinking about the possibility of there being a link between where you are on this profile and the change in pH. Before we actually go into kind of thinking about whether our pH is changing, which is kind of obvious, and we're going to say that at the end, we want to think about why behind these yellow dunes does it drop? Why does it increase in this zone here? And why does it increase slightly when we get back here where we had coniferous pine forestry, in particularly June we were visiting? So that is up for you to offer explanations. You can do some research. Now, you've got to think about the pH. Okay, the pH is dropping all of the way along, largely because of this decline in the amount of calcium carbonate. Now, there's a clear observation you're going to want to make. You're going to want to make that link when you are writing about this graph. So somewhere you're going to want to talk about this steady trend downwards from start to finish. So we start up here at 8.7 and we decrease at 6.3. And that trend is largely a downward trend the whole way. And you're going to want to then go back to that background research and say that one, strong possibility shown in the background research is this. That would be consistent, our data showing what the background research suggested should happen. However, it's not a steady decrease. We have this sharp decline. So you want to have made that link and then offer an explanation for that. Is that something to do with the nature of the soils or the plants that might start colonizing this area? And that is where you then want to maybe have a look at a second piece of data. So what happens to the number of species present in this zone here? So you want to have a look at some of the other data we gathered and think about this zone here and the average number of species appearing in this. So this minus 14 represents the act going down off the yellow dune, and then we can see this change. So that seems to suggest something's going on. We can also see that most of the land was covered in some form of vegetation, so there's very little exposed sand. So a combination of those two things would start to indicate that there's some kind of link between the plant life and that dramatic drop, because there's a noticeable increase. But why is there a noticeable increase in vegetation in this particular location behind the yellow dune? Likewise, when we think about going down to where we had this sudden increase, these sites, what happens with the number of species in this area? What happens with the amount of exposed, stuff not growing? And why is there this drop in species appearing in this zone, along with, open, no growth at all? And for that, you need to think about, well, what is the dune slack? What is happening in the dune slack? Where are we in terms of the water table? And these plants, what are they more like to have to deal with than these plants up here or here or here, which might explain that change. So there needs to be some kind of explanation. Okay. Right. So we've made some direct links to the background research. We'll have brought in the idea of the overall pattern and maybe use some data to describe that overall pattern, link that to calcium carbonate. We'll have made some observations about locations where the data didn't do exactly what might be expected. And we will have linked those both to the background research, the model diagram, as well as the other data we've gathered, which is always why you gather a lot of data in a geography project, because you don't ever know how useful that data is going to be when you're doing the analysis. Of course, that is just your changing gradient and your graph for the pH. We want to actually go a little bit further and be able to prove that there is a statistical link. So we will have brought in some scatter graphs, at least one, maybe two, The one that you'll be strongly encouraged to do is the scatter graph comparing the actual distance from the sea with the changing pH. And you're going to want to talk about, at this point, you're going to want to bring in that scatter graph to prove or to be able to say that the scatter graph clearly indicates that there's a strong negative relationship between these two, and then just explain what that means. So as distance increases away, as you move away from the sea, the pH decreases. What does that actually mean? What does pH decreasing actually mean? Now you can bring that piece of evidence, that scatter graph, in at any point you want, and place the scatter graph at the point when you are making this point that you are wanting to actually say, I've gone further than just have my two line graphs and my beach diagram, but actually I'm now going to look at the scatter graph and actually explain that this is even a stronger piece of evidence. And if you then have a further piece of evidence, if you did another scatter for the link maybe between pH and one of the other variables, and you felt that there was a strong relationship between one of the other variables, like the number of species and the pH, then you can also use that scatter graph to make that strong point that it's not just the changing calcium carbonate. It's not just as you move away from the sea, it gets less because of that changing calcium carbonate. And because of the distance, actually, it's got something to do with this other variable as well. And you might want to explain the role of that other variable in changing the pH. And if I just get you thinking about what I mean by explaining that other variable. So if we take the number of species present, so a greater diversity of species growing and dying in a beach environment is going to clearly form a soil, isn't it? And whatever is in those plants that are growing and dying play a role in the acidity of the soil. That is something you'll have learned in higher geography when you did the biosphere topic. So depending on the types of plants like to be present in an environment, that's going to have an influence on the soil. It's not just going to be seashells, which almost are acting as a parent material in the formation of this soil. In this case, we've also got an interaction with the vegetation that's growing. And of course, because that vegetation changes and becomes more diverse as we get to a more protected environment, especially back here at behind the grey dunes, where you have an almost fully colonized natural environment now, that's playing a role. So that's you'll have integrated and written about all your data presentation. You will have picked out your anomalies. You'll have talked about the areas like the dune slacks and behind the yellow dune and the grey dunes, and linked that to the changing pH and offered some insights. Most importantly, if I go back to this document here, you will have made some direct links to something you introduced in the background research. So you will have explained things in your background research, and I want you bringing those things back. So read back through the background research that you wrote and think about, what did I say there, and have I now proved what I've said there? What evidence did I present earlier I can now use to support my results? Now you'll notice I've stayed away from actually saying that you've answered your hypothesis. I've not come up with any statement at this stage. That's something we're going to deal with in the conclusions. But one thing that's left, and there is a tutorial for that, after each scatter graph that you've made some comment about what the scatter graph shows and what it helps prove, you can, if you wish, use the fourth and final tutorial in the findings to actually use a mathematical, or in this case, a statistical technique to prove that there is a relationship between the distance from the sea and the pH. Because the next tutorial will deal with what's called a Pearson's test. And if you want to have a listen, if you're confident with using that tutorial, it's a very high level way of analyzing your results using mathematics to prove that you've discovered something and compared what you've got and what you've discovered mathematically to what you expected to find. Okay. Right, that's done with all of the findings. And if you do go on to the final part, then I do encourage you to try to put it in. And then you'll be moving on to your conclusion.